Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Richard Shotton, who is an author of books such as The Choice Factory and most recently The Illusion of Choice. And he is also an expert in the practical application of behavioral sciences. So, first and foremost, Richard, thanks for coming on. And how's everything with you today?
Very well. Good to see you.
Yeah, no, looking forward to it ahead of Paddy's weekend, which is quite an
Oh yeah, of
infamous
course.
weekend.
I had
Yeah,
forgotten it was Paddy's. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
where I am. But with regards to maybe getting into the nitty gritty of your work, I'll probably leave that for a little bit later in the conversation. But like your journey into the realms of behavioral science and marketing, it's very intriguing to me because it's not necessarily a niche area, but it is one that maybe over the last 10, 20 years hasn't been maybe covered as much as it should have, or should be. And I suppose from your point of view, like, can you share maybe a pivotal moment or experience that kind of solidified your passion for kind of those intersection of disciplines?
Of course. It's an interesting one because I think normally when people develop a passion, there's not a pivotal moment. They just gradually drift into a love of history or football or whatever it is. But with behavioural science, there was very much a pivotal moment. I had been working at a media agency. I was working at a media agency, and one of our clients was the British government, and it was the Department of Health, and they were asking us to try and help them get more people to donate blood.
Mm,
The campaigns hadn't been going that well. There's a bit of a shortfall, and I'd come back from what was a bit of a car crash client meeting. I was in a taxi on the way back to the office, and I happened to try and distract myself by reading The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And at
yeah.
the back of that book, he covers in quite little detail, it's quite a brief summary, but he covers a series of experiments by two American psychologists called Latané and Darling. And the experiments back in the 1960s were into an idea called the bystander effect, which is essentially if you ask loads of people to come to your help, there is a diffusion of responsibility. Every individual person becomes slightly less likely to do it. They all leave it up to someone else. And I can remember reading that and thinking, look, this is exactly the problem we have on the blood service. We go out and ask the entire nation to give blood, and most people think to themselves, well, why don't I leave it up to a neighbour? They can go through the time, the hassle, the pain. So reading about this idea, went and spoke to the creative agency, a lovely planner down there called Charlie Snow, and said to him, look, why don't we try and avoid this problem of the bystander effect? Why don't we try and make a more direct plea to the audience? Why don't we try and create a sense of personal responsibility? So quite a crude tweak. We stopped saying blood stocks are low in England, please donate. And we tested saying blood stocks are low in Basildon or Birmingham or Burnley. And we
Mm,
tailored the message to the town. So blood stocks low in Burnley, please donate. Now, a week later, get the response data back, and we see that there's been a 10 or 15% improvement in cost per donations. The ads were becoming more effective. And that was, eye-opening to me. The idea that you could take a study from what would that have been about 40, 50 years prior, take a study that had been done in an academic setting, apply it to a practical challenge, and then see the results. So I became obsessed with this field of psychology, or what's become known as behavioral science. And in the intervening 20 years, I've specialized in taking academic studies and then trying to use them to commercial ends. So sometimes it's getting people to donate blood, but more often than not, it'll be getting them to pick a particular trainer brand or a chocolate bar or a particular a beer. So how can you take findings from psychology and then change the marketing you do so that it works with human nature rather than against it?
yeah. And I was only thinking earlier as I was scrolling on my phone, as most
Yeah,
millennials do these
yeah,
days, that the kind of choice I had at so many different stages to click on a sponsored post or not was it. I recognized it more than I usually do, which is probably down to the fact I knew I'd be chatting to you later. But the kind of, or even in your book, like the factory, it kind of takes a deep dive into the quirks or even the biases of kind of human decision making around all that. And around when, say, you're doing such a comprehensive deep dive into a topic, like, say, for instance, when you're writing the Choice Factory book, like, can you recount like something outrageously surprising or unexpected that you found during your research that kind of just left you blown away, or was it always stuff that you kind of were aware of?
Oh, great question. No, I think the maybe the one that I found most surprising. Perhaps this was the second book, The Illusion of Choice, on the Choice Factory. But there's a fascinating study by Sally Blount and Max Baseman, late 90s, maybe 1996. And it is on students, so take it with a pinch of salt. Most of the more modern studies are now done on members of the public to make them a bit more representative, but this one was done on students. But what they do is when students are arriving on campus, um, they go up to them and they tell them a little white lie. They say, "Will you come to our lab tomorrow? We'll pay you $7, and in exchange, you have to give us half an hour of your time and do some maths puzzles." And 72% of people say yes. Next group, students arriving at campus, Blount Baseman give them the same basic offer. Tomorrow we'll have an experiment, take half an hour of your time, but this time they change the amount of money being offered. So now it's $8. It's $1 more, $8. But they continue their lies and they say, "I'm really sorry. We were paying people $10 earlier, but we've run out of money and we can only afford to pay you $8 now." Now, essentially, what they've done is offered this second group more money, but they've raised this spectre of other people getting an even better deal.
Hmm.
And what happens, counter to what maybe standard economics would suggest, is the proportion of people willing to take that job drops. It's now down to 54%. So even though people are getting paid more money, you've now got 54% agreeing rather than 72%. So what Blount and Baseman argued is, and we are not just interested in maximising our financial benefit from a situation. We are also deeply attuned to fairness. We're also deeply attuned to what others receive. That, I think, surprised me most of all, especially because there are experiments done by people like De Waal which show exactly the same thing happens with capuchin monkeys. So De Waal's experiments on YouTube, people should probably look on YouTube. It will do it better justice than my slightly crap explanation. But what he basically does is trains capuchin monkeys to hand over a stone in return for a cucumber slice. And the monkey will do this all day. Gives the stone, gets a cucumber slice. What De Waal then does is bring in another monkey, puts that monkey in a perspex cage next to the other one so they can see each other. And he starts paying the new monkey with grapes. And according to De Waal, I think his words are something like, "The preferences of my monkeys match the prices in a supermarket. Grapes are far preferred than cucumbers." And what happens is the original monkey, the one who'd been completely happy with this deal, loses their complete shit. Now they get paid in a cucumber and they're throwing the stones at the scientists, they're shaking the cage furiously. They are showing exactly the same behavior as students in 1996. Now, our reaction to a situation is not just about the inherent benefits, the money we get. It's deeply influenced by a sense of fairness, a sense of what others are achieving. And I think that idea is something that can be harnessed far more regularly in persuasive techniques. If you can rouse your audience to think they've been treated unfairly by a competitor, then you are tapping into one of the most powerful biases. When you see one of these insights that works both in humans and an animal, we had a common ancestor with 3 million years ago, you're onto something very, very powerful.
Yeah, and you've spoken in the past on podcasts and even in some of your books, you've touched on the idea around like a lot of people now, I think it's like 70-80% of people do their retail shopping on a phone, or like I think it's Gen Z is up to like 80%, but without going down that rabbit hole, the one of the topics you talk about when it comes to like biases around our behaviors is the demand for an item. So like everyone more or less every week or at least on a monthly basis is trying to buy something or at very least browsing online, whether it's through an ad or just through a site they want to maybe have a browse on. But one topic that you spoke about is our reaction to unavailability. So you spoke about how, if, like, for instance, this is what's happening to me at the moment with Zara, and this is not a sponsored post by any stretch of the
Yeah.
imagination. I am looking for these specific joggers. They're very light. The texture of them, they're not heavy, they're not thick, because I want them for warmer weather. And every time I go on to Zara UK, Zara Ireland, they have it as unavailable. And you've
Yes.
spoken in the past about the reaction to someone, a person, through a product or service being unavailable, sold out, other
Yeah.
terminologies. Can you kind of explain that to
Oh,
some of the
definitely.
viewers today?
That's a great study. So it was conducted by Peterson at the University of Texas, 2020. Gets 1,107 people to look at a website. It's a lovely large sample, and on this website, the participants have to buy something, but occasionally an item isn't there. The twist in the experiment is just as you say. Sometimes that item is labelled out of stock, sometimes unavailable, sometimes sold out. Peterson questions everyone later on as to how disappointed they are, how irritated they are with the brand and the product. And he sees a very clear pattern. People are significantly more irritated, more disappointed when that product is labelled out of stock or unavailable compared to sold out. So, sold out, they're about 15% less irritated. His argument is this is around the principle of social proof. So, social proof is the idea that we are deeply, deeply influenced by how others behave. And if something looks like it's popular, it becomes more appealing. We're more likely to want to buy it. So, going back to his study, if a brand like Zara label a product as unavailable, they are drawing attention to their logistical ineptitude. They're drawing attention to the fact they couldn't get enough stock from one place to another, and that annoys people. If they had labeled it as sold out, well, suddenly they're drawing attention to the popularity of the item. They're harnessing social proof. I love that as a experiment because for a brand, there's no difference in costs between how you label an item. It doesn't cost any more to label something sold out versus unavailable. So you can take this finding from a really large scale behavioral science experiment, apply it to your website at no extra cost, and make sure that you're working with human nature, not against it. You're reducing unnecessary irritation.
Mm. And that makes me think more and more about, and I'm sure you're aware of the statistics and maybe the reactions to things like this, where you see online, whether it's a commercial transaction or even just browsing. But like that, I think, is at the heart of every, say, marketing campaign or advertisement. We'll see that ethics will always like play a crucial role when, like, you're looking into the behavioral science of it in marketing. But like, has there ever been a time, I'm sure there has been, where you've like witnessed a campaign or certain strategy that maybe was balancing that fine line between effectiveness, but then also maybe sacrificing ethical considerations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and my point of view is behavioral science isn't an invention. This isn't like aeronautics or pharmacology where we're creating something. Behavioral science is just a description of how people behave. It's describing human nature and identifying how you can use that human nature to be as persuasive as possible. So, behavioral science in and of itself is a neutral description. But I think you're absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that it can be used for good or bad. And just because a bias has been identified, it doesn't give practitioners license to use that willy nilly without ethics. I think that you could draw an analogy here with something like rhetoric. You can teach people to speak very well and speak in a motivating way. It's not the rhetoric that is the ethical problem, it's the ends to which they use that rhetoric. You can use a speech to encourage people to love their neighbors. You can use rhetoric to encourage people to want to burn their neighbor's house down. Rhetoric isn't
Yeah.
the problem, it's the ends that it's put. So if people are trying to confuse customers or get them to do something that isn't in their interests, I think that's when you start getting into problematic areas. Often, you know, brands, I think, want to behave ethically, and what I would generally stress if I'm working with them is, firstly, the ethics. You should use these ideas responsibly, but also appeal to their self-interest. If you take a long-term view and think, I don't just want to sell something to a customer in the next month, I want them to come back again and again. Once you start thinking about a long-term relationship, most of the tactics that are unethical but maybe short-term effective, you realize are not going to do you any um, benefits in the long term. So I think there's two areas here: encouraging people to step away from ethical behavior because it's the right thing to do, but also encouraging to step away from unethical behavior because in the long term, you're going to get caught out, and it's very hard to win back that trust.
Yeah, and it's you nearly see it on a monthly basis where whether it's a celebrity maybe with falsely advertising certain products, or as you said, the ethics behind it are called into question straight away. And as I said before we went on air, I used to work kind of in a marketing role myself. And one thing I found really interesting about that was like we're in a world where I think like data reigns supreme at the end of the day. I'm sure AI may take over that and give us a new avenue of different possibilities. But for now, obviously, we're in a data driven world, so to speak, when it comes to business. But like, have you ever seen, or from what you've studied, is there any instances where data driven decisions around a marketing campaign could be challenged by behavioral insights? Because as you said, sometimes behavioral insights you can't really put a number to or a percentage behind.
Ooh, so absolutely. I think the biggest area where data can be misleading in marketing is direct questioning of consumers, and that is still the predominant way brands find out why people buy their products. They'll send them a survey, or they'll get them together into a focus group, and they'll ask people questions about, why do you buy this product? What would you want from a product? Well, how could we make it better? Psychologists, behavioral scientists would be aghast at that. They would worry that direct questioning is deeply, deeply misleading. Big theme of the experiments in behavioral science is that what people say motivates them and what actually motivates them are wildly different. So, for example, there's a 2008 study from Robert Cialdini, who's at Arizona State University, and he works for the hotel chain in Southwest USA, persuades that hotel chain to let him alter the messages running in guest rooms, encouraging them to reuse their towels. So one set of rooms see a standard message: please reuse your towels, it's good for the environment. And 35% of people comply. Next set of rooms, he gets rid of any logical, rational reason for complying, gets rid of any mention of the environment, and instead he says, please reuse your towels. Most guests who stayed in this room have done so. So this is tailored social proof. He is making it clear what the norm of behaviour is amongst like-minded people. And when he does that, there is a 40% increase in compliance, up to 49% of people reusing their towels. So very clear study, powerful study. It's done in a naturalistic, realistic setting, and he captures this data via the cleaners, so people don't know they're taking part in the experiments. It's really clean data, I think quite robust. But then what he does as a comparison is, after he's got these results, he goes out and sends out a survey. And he says to people, look, imagine you're in a hotel. This is a new group of people. Imagine you're in a hotel. Imagine you saw these two messages. Which would influence you to change your behavior? And what people claim is the complete opposite of what actually happened in reality. People say, oh, I wouldn't be influenced by social proof. I would be influenced by knowing about the environment. Now, that is a consistent theme of experiments. What people say, what they do, wildly different things. Sometimes consumers straight out lie. They know they're deceiving the researcher, but they want to project a positive image. But the bigger problem is what psychologists call confabulations. So if you're confabulating, you are trying to tell the truth, but because you don't know your own motivations, you end up being misleading. So data is not data is not data. If your data is coming from a survey in which you are directly asking people to say why they bought your lager or your trainers, I would say that is highly dubious, because it rests on the assumption that people know and are willing to tell you what motivated them. Behavioural science, in my opinion, is far more robust because it's data driven, but it gets that data from simple test and control experiments. You set up a base situation, then you repeat that base situation very, very closely, but you change one variable, and then any difference in attitudes or responses between the two situations, you can attribute back to the single change variable. So in Cialdini's towel experiment, similar hotel rooms, everything's the same. It's just that message, that tweak to the message that changes. And that's a far more robust way to generate data into what really motivates people.
Yeah, interesting. The maybe response I have to that in my brain initially is the opposite side of that, where data is maybe important, and one of the key things that is used especially in marketing is numbers. Or even if we look at your book, The Illusion of Choice, you have 16 and a half as opposed to the rounded of 16 or 16, sorry, 17, excuse me. But when it comes to percentages, but ultimately numbers being used in, as I said, publications or even marketing, like what are some of the key things to maybe look out for, how they would actually affect us?
Well, you mentioned the subtitle of The Illusion Choice, the idea that there are 16 and a half behavioural biases that influence people. Now, the reason I picked that precise number, there's a lovely experiment from a psychologist called Schindler, who's at Rutgers University, and very simple study, recruits a group of people, randomizes them into two groups. First group see an ad for a deodorant, picture of the deodorant, and then there is a claim saying reduces perspiration by 50%. 50%. Next group see the same picture, same basic ad, but he tweaks the claim so it doesn't say 50%. It either says 57%, sorry, 53% or 47%. Then questions both groups as to the credibility of the claim and the accuracy of the claim. And Schindler finds that the group who saw the precise number rate it as 10% more accurate than the round number and 5% more credible. His argument is that over repeated exposure over time, the public have learnt that those who are knowledgeable tend to talk precisely and specifically. Those who are speculating tend to talk in generalities. Now, think about this with your own life. If someone stopped you this afternoon and said, "How old's your sister?" you'd say, "Okay, she's 31." If someone said, "How old's Bob, who lives seven houses down?" you'd say, "Okay, well, he's an old guy. He's in his 60s." When we know something, we tend to talk precisely. When we don't, we tend to talk in generalities. And that happens so regularly, people fuse the two things. So they begin to believe that precision in and of itself is a signifier of accuracy. So you go back to that Schindler study, and it's basically the same statistic, but this tiny little tweak, regardless of any other cues of believability, but just by making it precise, it feels more accurate, it feels more credible. So that is I think, a really practical finding from a psychologist that lots of people can use. If you want to give a client reasons to pick you, don't give them 10, give them 3.5 or 8. It feels like you've picked that volume because it's the right number, not that it just happens to be society's kind of norm of responding. Or if you're giving people prices, there are some similar studies which show precise prices are viewed as better value than round ones. There's a lovely bit of data from Uber where they showed that people were more likely, in real world settings with their own cash, more likely to take a surge price if it was 2.1x rather than 2x. So you've got this wonderful opportunity as a brand. If you're ever trying to sell something at a round price, you can increase the price slightly. So maybe you're selling your services at £1,000 a day, put the price up to £1,075. Not only do you get £75 extra margin, you'll also be believed to be better value, because the general rule of thumb your clients have is round prices have been marked up loads and they'll be marked up to their disadvantage.
Interesting. It actually annoys me when I see, like, say for instance, deodorant's like 72 hours protection, which I cannot wait to meet the man or woman who uses deodorant for 3 or 4 days, and it maximizes
Yeah.
their
Luckily, we're
kind
doing
of
this remotely,
hygiene quality.
so
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly.
You're a
But
very good point there. That's 72 hours, but probably one, it's suspicious. It's like exactly 3 days. Why not say 77? And two, everyone
yeah,
says it, so it just blends into the background. There's some lovely
yeah,
work by I think it's an American psychologist. I think it's Michael Santos, where in one of the more bizarre experiments that I look at, he sends his graduate students out onto the streets of San Francisco and asks them to beg for money. And sometimes they ask for a round number. It's like either some coins or 25 cents. Other times he gets them to ask for a very specific number, like 37 cents or 17 cents. And what he finds is people are far more likely to give the money when it's that surprisingly specific number. And Santos's argument is people find life complex and confusing. There's thousands of decisions to make. We cannot weigh up all those decisions in a fully considered way. So he says we have scripts. So if a familiar thing occurs to us, almost our mind goes click whir, and then we just respond in a knee-jerk way. So he says the script is a beggar asks for money, I just say no. That's the script. That means that we don't have to evaluate the individual merits of each beggar. We just say no every time. But Santos says that script can only come into action if the beggar asks in a standardized way. If they suddenly ask for something quite surprising, like 37 cents or 17 cents, there's no script to respond to that. So people at least have to consider the merits of the request. Doesn't mean they will give money, but they at least consider it. And that means there is a chance for um, a beggar to be listened to. Now, interestingly, I think Santos did that in like 1994. That study found in academia certainly seems to have spread to the streets, because I would say for at least 10 years, beggars in London have been applying that principle. Now, unfortunately, it probably only has a certain lifespan, because once everyone starts doing it, it becomes the norm and the audience will develop a script again. But the principle of what Santos calls the peak effect, if you ask for something in a surprising way, you disrupt people's autopilot, disrupt their pre-programmed scripts, and at least get consideration for your request. That's quite interesting. I think that can be applied in a lot of sales areas.
yeah. It's interesting you say it jolts some people out of their sleepwalking. That's maybe
Yeah,
an aggressive terminology around it, but it's how
I think that's a fair.
I'm
I think it's fair.
considered, yeah, slightly insane that if I'm meeting someone or if I'm collecting someone, I'd be the type of guy. So, like, it's just past 2:30 now, but if I knew I'd be somewhere in 10 minutes, I'd be like, I'll be outside your place at 2:42, and they'll just be like, why not just say 2:45? And it's like, well, I don't be waiting for 3 minutes. So
Yeah.
I'm quite literally the only person in my group of
Oh,
friends or family that would use that
I
terminology, even though it's accurate.
I am a fan of that. So I quite often do trainings and workshops for brands or individuals. And let's say we're having a 15-minute break and we're stopping at 1:02. I'll always say, can you come back at 1:17? And people are far more likely actually to come out back at that time, rather than saying come back at 1:15 or 1:30, because it feels like you have specifically chosen it for a reason. 1:30 feels like it's just kind of a vague suggestion, come back roughly at that time. There's a lot to be said for precision in requests as well.
Yeah. And is there any feedback on that, or any studies on the precision, as you said, whether it's numbers based or
So precision, we've got the Schindler study around
yeah.
Believability and credibility. You've got Santos and getting people's attention from whether people are more likely to come back in terms of um, time, like saying come back at 147 rather than 145. I've not seen a study, but I think the general direction of all those other studies would suggest it would work. But it would be a brilliant thing to, you could set up a reasonably simple study to do it. You know, if you know, all of us can act like behavioural scientists, you know, you could think, well, okay, I've got 10 training sessions coming up, 5 I'm going to do 145, 5 I'll say 147, and then you could just monitor proportion of people who turn up on time. And within 10 sessions, you'd probably have a reasonable enough sample to draw a conclusion. So I like that principle of, if there isn't a study out there by an academic, don't think that you just have to walk away from the idea. You can set up your own simple experiments to find out if these principles work in a new area.
Yeah, interesting. And as a rugby coach for the last 10 years, there are certain things where, as you said, turning up for meetings or length of sessions or warm up times, it is interesting if you could manipulate it or get results
Oh,
from that.
well, if you think about, getting people to turn up on time, forget precision for a bit, but there are quite a few studies from the behavioural insights team and other academics, and in terms of hospital settings, because for British Department of Health, the NHS, where it is free at point of delivery because it's paid out of general taxation, you have a problem of, because it's a free service, people sometimes don't give it the respect it deserves, so people don't turn up to their doctor's appointment. So the government's constantly trying to experiment to see how you reduce those no-shows. I know of 2 interesting experiments. The first is by a academic at Columbia University called Steve Martin, and what he does is introduce a change to a chain of GPs in Bedfordshire. So what used to happen was patients would come out of their first appointment, go and see the receptionist, and the receptionist would give them a card with the date and time of their next appointment written on. Martin makes 2 amends. First test, he says to the receptionist, look, when you give that card back to the person with the date and time on, just hold it for a second and ask the patient to repeat back to you the date and time. That's the first intervention. And when he does that, there is a 3.5% reduction in no-shows. Second intervention, he says to the receptionist, look, when you give that card to the patient, leave it blank and ask the patient to fill it in themselves then and there. When he does that intervention, there is an 18% reduction in no-shows. Now, Martin's argument is one of the big drivers of behaviour is a desire to be consistent with our past actions or our past statements. Now, we have a lot of very negative terminology about inconsistent people. We frown on it culturally. But Martin's argument is that power of consistency is only tapped into if the other party has made an active commitment. So if I'm in a GP surgery and I think to myself, I'm going to turn up on time, that doesn't tap into the bias consistency. But if I've said out loud to the receptionist, if I've said it out in public or I've written it down, that element of activeness taps into this bias. So if you want to get your players turning up on time, getting them to, rather than just saying, please turn up on time, and they'll passively, silently agree, get them to vocalize
Yeah.
it, that would help. The second study that might be of interest, and I can't remember the specific date, I can only remember the winning version. Michael Holsworth did a series of experiments around no-shows at doctors, and the winning intervention was when he said, please turn up, otherwise it will cost the NHS £70. Now, the interesting thing was, if he just said, please turn up, otherwise it costs lots of money to the NHS, when you're vague, very little effect. When you are specific about the cost, that's when it had the most powerful change of behavior in Holsworth's experiment. So again, I guess that's precision. Tell people concretely, clearly, precisely what impact not turning up has. Oh, and the final study, if you, and I won't go into the details, but if you tell people, most people, 9 out of 10 turn up to the doctor's appointment on time, that's super effective as well. You want people to feel like they are behaving different from the crowd by being late, if there is a sense that that's what everyone does, then you're screwed. You need to make the behaviour feel aberrant, not normal.
Yeah, interesting. A lot of that is relatable in any setting I can think to.
Absolutely, it's a great thing about
With
these days. Yeah, commerce, personal, professional. You can apply them in all sorts of different ways.
yeah, and with some of the research you've studied there, I often think, and I'm just going to use coaching as an example, is that like I grew up, I'm a millennial. I coach now Gen Zs. I used to coach some people who were considered millennials, and as I said earlier, it's like 80% of Gen Z, I think, use their mobile phones to search anything. So it's a huge part of their DNA at this point. And I found it fascinating when I worked for Pinterest, the company, and when I helped like businesses with their advertising campaigns, the way we presented a certain ad on a phone had to be vastly different to how it would turn up on a laptop or even TV or iPad. And then also depending on what age group we would target, we would have to change the design. Some would have to be text heavy, some wouldn't, some would have to purely be video, some wouldn't. But when it comes to the actual generations, and we can see the differences already, especially if you look at, say, attention spans, for example, comparing now to maybe 25, 30 years ago, it's down to like 8%, sorry, 8 seconds at the minute. Are you aware of any like the behavioral differences between, say, Gen Z and the millennials and then the previous generations?
Um, I would say most studies look at people on average. However, there are certainly some studies that look at variances by generation. Um, and the one that may be of interest, I think I think she was called Wozmek. But I'm slightly worried I'm mixing her up with the iPhone founder. I'm pretty sure she was called Wozmek. She There's this famous video online. So Candid Camera, 1964, do a program where they put hidden CCTVs in a lift, and when a member of the public walks in, there are three um, staff members of Candid Camera, unbeknown to the member of the public. They just think that the member of the public thinks those other three people in the lift are just other passers-by. But what the Candid Camera staff do is they're all facing forward in the lift. And then as the lift goes down, they all shuffle around and start facing another direction. And what happens is, on this clip at least, most members of the public, slightly comically, copy them and they start facing it another direction. It's a really famous clip. If people have done a psychology undergraduate degree, I bet their lecturer showed them that clip, raises a laugh. About 40 years after the clip ran, an academic called Wozmek thinks to herself, well, wait a minute, this is all interesting, but how do we know it's a genuine finding? How do we know it's just not 50 hours of footage condensed and edited selectively to show something? So she reruns that experiment and she finds it's a genuine result. That if you have 3 or 4 people in a lift who are coordinated and turn to face the rear, normally most members of the public will copy them. It's in these situations of uncertainty we are very, very influenced by what the crowd does. But one of the interesting things, and this is what I'm bringing up, that she did was cut the data by age. And what she found, which runs counter to a lot of the editorial you might see in the trade press, is that the younger people were, the more influenced by the crowd they were. So we often talk about independent nature, the authenticity of Gen Z millennials. But if you look at experiments, they are deeply, deeply influenced by what the crowd is doing. So it's not here that the bias of social proof of copying works in some age groups, doesn't work in others. You find it across all age groups, but it is more pronounced amongst the young. And I would say that is a reasonably representative finding, that most of these experiments work on most people. Yes, you might see variance by income level, by age, by culture, but it's nuances, tweaks, little variants rather than radically a different behavior. Because frankly, most of these biases have an evolutionary benefit, and whether you are living on the plains of Kenya 100,000 years ago, or London in 2024, we've all got the same operating system. It's just the society and technology that varies. Our fundamentals are remarkably consistent.
Mm. And that nearly leads me to the next question I wanted to ask
Mm.
is how marketing is going to change. Like, listen, 15 years ago, if I said you could have a free program on your Google that could write your college essays or create outrageous pictures of celebrities and crazy settings known as AI was coming down like the train tracks, you'd probably laugh in my face, let alone believe me. But like, how is the kind of rise in technology and the overusage in some people's eyes of technology, in your view, going to affect the marketing and advertising space over the next 5-10 years?
So I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I think it's a famous physicist who said predictions are dangerous things, especially when they pertain to the future. And it is very hard to, I think, predict how society changes, how tech changes. But in a way, knowing that those predictions are super hard and whatever we think 2030 will look like will probably be wildly wrong, I would argue means, well, what you should do is put more energy and effort as a marketer, focusing on the things that never change, the fundamentals, like we copy what others do, like if we're given three prices, we'll pick the middle one, like we believe someone more if they admit a flaw in their argument. These are evergreen insights into human nature. Human nature isn't going to change, but the other side of the equation, society and technology, will change. So I would say, rather than putting all your efforts into trying to predict what happens with tech, put more of that thinking time into learning the universal principles of human behavior. And then when 2030 comes around, whatever changes, at least you're an expert in the consistent part. And that probably gives you an advantage over your competitors.
Yeah, true. That's a good way to look at it, because who know who knows what's ahead
Yeah. Yeah.
for a technology landscape point of view. And when it
Yeah.
comes to behavioral science,
Uh,
from, do you need to say
Oh no,
something?
no. I was just
Oh,
thinking because I realised I kind of swerved that question slightly, but there is a study, and it's not one I'm hugely familiar with. So I've got the basic flow. I think it was by Knox, but it was about what was definitely true is it's about racing tipsters. So he gets a load of racing tipsters, and this was back in the 1960s, and he gives them, let's say, four variables. I don't know enough about racing to see what the important things were, but maybe last five
neither do I.
races. Yeah, okay, well, I'll get away with it. I shouldn't have said that. Last five race results, preference for heaviness or dryness of the ground, that type of thing. The key facts. And he asked those tipsters to predict, who was going to win the races. And then what he does is gives them more data for another group of races. So now, rather than just the five core things, he's given them 10 bits of data. Keeps on doing this. So some people have 5 bits of data, some 10, some 15, some 20. What he finds is that the accuracy of their predictions doesn't change between the settings. More data, it's just a minor variation accuracy. What does change is confidence. In every single setting, the tipsters were overconfident in their predictions. They thought they'd be more accurate than they were. But as you get more dating, there is more disparity. As you have more data, people's belief in their ability to predict goes up, but the actual performance stays the same. And I think there is an interesting analogy there with marketing, because we have more data than ever. That's probably just going to keep on growing. And the danger is the benefits of more data are often offset by drawing our attention away from what the kind of fundamental criteria. We sometimes get caught up in peripheral bits of data that don't really have much of an effect. So the accuracy, I think, of our marketing and our predictions about consumers won't necessarily go up. But the danger is our confidence goes wildly into that overconfident area. And if you become overconfident as a marketer, the danger is you don't spend enough money behind your idea. You don't push yourself to improve it. And maybe you don't learn from your competitors because you're so caught up in your own brilliance. So there is I think, a fascinating psychological overlap between an excess of data and this problem of overconfidence.
Hmm. And pretty much the last question I want to ask you, Richard, is like with everything, I had a science expert there on a few days ago, and every single topic you can discuss, it has its fair share of myths and misunderstandings. And like, what is the big or the one misconception about human behavior in marketing, for instance, that you find yourself having to debunk
Okay, great.
most frequently?
So, well, there's three, but we've covered two. So I'll just reiterate those and then talk about one new one. I think there's a myth that people are individuals, that there's an awful lot of experimentation showing we are very much influenced by what others are doing. The second myth is people know their own motivations and want to share them, which leads us to using surveys and focus groups, which I think are frankly misleading most of the time. So those we've covered. The third one that we haven't touched on is that we believe the way to change behavior is to motivate people to want to change. Now, of course, motivation has an effect, but the argument from people like Daniel Kahneman, Bergman and Rogers, Richard Thaler, is we overestimate the importance of motivation and we radically, massively underestimate the impact of friction. So we think the way to change behavior is to get people to want to exercise more or to quit smoking, whereas the behavioral scientists will often argue the way to change behavior is to make it as easy as possible, to identify the small barriers that are blocking people and put more efforts into resolving those. Now, everyone listening will know that friction will put people off behaving in a particular way. But the interesting insight from behavioral scientists is that it puts people off more than you tend to imagine. Most people will underestimate the role of friction. So I think one myth that we could do with changing is this prioritization of appeal. And instead, we should reprioritize budgets, reprioritize effort, and put more time, money, effort into making a product as easy to purchase as possible rather than fixating on making it appealing. So go through the customer journey, identify even the most trivial bit of friction, and if you remove that inconsequential barrier, you'll tend to have an outsized effect. So that's probably the single biggest myth that we haven't covered.
Okay, interesting. Again, so yeah, Richard, that more or less
Oh,
gets
fantastic.
the chunky aspect of the podcast out of the way. I do finish with a quick fire
Okay.
round, which is a little bit more lighthearted, but feel free to cite references if you feel it's necessary. But yeah, with regards to the first question, it is, what is your favorite film of all time?
Oh, Groundhog Day or The Godfather? Groundhog for comedy, Godfather for drama.
Okay, what is in your opinion, greatest marketing campaign ever?
Um, Nespresso. Rory Sutherland talks about this one a lot. By putting their coffee granules into pods, they changed the comparison set. So people thought a 50 pence pot of coffee was great value compared to a £3 Starbucks. If, like, average person, they'd stuff those coffee granules into kilo bags and sold them on the shelves of Carrefour or Tesco, I think the per kilo price is about £80. Now, no one would push aside a £5, £10 bag of coffee and take home an £80 kilo bag of Nespresso. It'd feel like a complete rip-off. But their genius was shifting the mental comparison set, creating this subtly suggested comparison set of a Starbucks, and encouraging people to pay an absolute fortune. Because if you see a pod that gives you a cup-sized serving, you're suddenly thinking of Starbucks, not Cafe Nero, not Dow. So I think that's probably one of the greatest ever.
Yeah, and George Clooney obviously
Yeah, well, he helps.
has
Yeah,
a decent
yeah.
face to go with it. And what is your favorite chocolate bar?
Oh, crisps. I hate chocolate, but I could eat my own body weight in crisps. So yeah, not a great fan of chocolate, but a really punchy, salty, vinegary crisp like a disco. That would be my favorite, I think.
Okay. One thing I always hear from people, I'm not a massive crisp man. I'm more of the chocolate, so the
Okay.
yin and yang. But I hear that Ireland do really good crisps
Do you know
from
what?
people who are.
After I said it, I thought on the airport on the way back, I stocked up on. I think, and apologies if I got this wrong. I think they're called Flanagan's. They're kind of your premium crisp, but they were very, very
Yeah,
good.
we
Yeah,
have.
yeah, yeah. I've never
Yeah,
seen them in England, but I've picked up those in Dublin before. They're very nice. Uh,
yeah. There's
Potatoes are
some.
okay, but
Yeah,
Flanagan's very nice. Hmm.
yeah. You feel a bit more sophisticated having
Yeah.
Flanagan's, and maybe
Yes. Yeah.
O'Donnell's is the new kind of high quality one
Okay,
as
I'll
well.
keep that out. But just to show, sorry, quite how I'm not making this up about loving crisps. For my 40th birthday, the best present I got was from a friend, and she had individually wrapped 40 different bags of crisps, like as in different flavors, different brands. And
Yeah,
I think that was the best present ever. Yeah.
yeah. That is, you have a good friend when they're willing to do that.
Yes. Yeah. True. True. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And next question is, what is worse, or what is the worst? Cleaning the dishes, hoovering the house, or changing the bed sheets?
Changing the bed sheets. Uh, if there is a task designed to make me realise I'm uncoordinated, it's changing the bed sheets. Yeah,
Yeah, it's funny. I've asked that question, I'd say, talking about behavioral science.
yeah,
I think it's to like 14, 15 people.
yeah.
And I'd say 12 out of the 15 have said bed sheets. They've all
Okay,
been male.
yeah,
And then the two who have said hoovering the house or otherwise, or the dishes, have been female.
yeah.
So
There's a very good
I think,
experiment with couples. So you get a couple and you say to them individually, you split them apart and say, what proportion of the housework do you do? And what, obviously, logically, those two numbers would have to, if they're accurate, add up to 100. But the number that comes back is 150 to 200%. Everyone thinks they are doing more than the fair share because they know the stuff they do that looms large. They were there at the time; they saw it. They don't account for all the things that their partner does when they're not around. I took
well,
that principle and reran it at one of the agencies I worked at, and I got together a team of people who'd worked on a pitch, split them all up, and asked them individually how much of the effort that went into the pitch did you do. And the figure that came back was something like 300% when I totted them all up. And I thought that was fascinating because it makes you realize, well, unless you go to extraordinary efforts, teams are going to become really pissed off in agencies or in businesses because everyone thinks they're hard done by. They're overestimating how much they've done versus other people. I always meant to turn that into an article, but I never quite got around to it. And by the time I did, I'd lost the data. So I feel like I missed a trick there. I think it was an interesting finding.
yeah, absolutely. And lastly, Richard, if I could ask you a question I haven't today, what would it be?
um, I don't know. Favorite song? I've enjoyed the question so far. Or we could have talked about crisps a bit longer. Yeah, favorite. We could have gone through each variant. Favorite beef crisp. Favorite cheese crisp.
Yeah,
Yeah,
buffalo, salt and
yeah,
vinegar,
yeah, yeah,
etc., etc.
yeah.
But yeah, no, Richard, listen, thanks a million for having the chat today. I will, for anyone who's interested in your work, I'll attach your website, the books, everything else. And I suppose just before I let you go, is there anything you'd like anyone who's interested to know or look out for from your end? Or
Oh, just yeah. I mean, check out the books. I think that's the best guide to the work I've done. So, the Choice Factory and the Illusion of Choice. I think that. Yeah. Thank you.
perfect. Well, listen, enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'm sure here in Dublin and Ireland it'll be pretty manic. And thanks again for coming on, and listen, all the best in the future.
Cheers, Richie. Thanks a lot.
Take care.